Mary Stuart entered the world under the shadow of dynastic ambition. Born on December 8, 1542 at Linlithgow Palace in Scotland, she became queen when she was just 6 days old following the death of her father James the Chamber. Her ascent to the throne marked not a triumph, but a burden a crown passed to an infant in a realm teetering between religious reformation and political fragmentation. As nobles schemed and Protestant firebrands gained influence, Mary was spirited away to France in 1548, aged only 5, to shield her from English aggression under Henry VIII, who aimed to force a union between the crowns through marriage or conquest. In France, Mary's life unfolded like that of a royal fairy tale until it didn't. She was raised at the opulent French court, educated in Latin, Greek history, music, and languages, and groomed to be queen not just of Scotland, but of France as well. In 1558, she married the young Dauphin Francis, heir to the French throne. At just 16, she became Queen of France when Francis ascended in 1559. Yet this golden chapter was painfully brief. Francis died from an ear infection a year later in 1560, and with his death, Mary's influence at the French court crumbled instantly. Catherine de' Medici, the Dowager Queen, asserted her dominance, and Mary was quietly pushed out. The widowed teen queen returned to a homeland she barely knew. Scotland in 1561 was unrecognizable, a patchwork of warring lords, growing Protestant fervor and suspicion of Mary's Catholic faith. Though her arrival was celebrated by some others, viewed her as a foreign-educated Catholic interloper. Mary's personal charisma and fluency in diplomacy could only mask so much. She was a foreigner on her own throne, and the ground beneath her was far from stable. Her claim to the English throne further complicated matters. Mary was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII of England, giving her a legitimate claim in the eyes of many Catholics who considered Elizabeth I, daughter of Anne Boleyn, and Henry VIII illegitimate. To Elizabeth, Mary was not merely a distant cousin, but a threat in human form. This rivalry, though not yet explosive, cast a chilling shadow over every decision Mary would make. Back in Edinburgh, Mary attempted to navigate the storm. She tolerated Protestantism in her court and tried to balance opposing religious factions, a tightrope act with no net below. Yet her very presence ignited tensions. Nobles questioned her allegiance, preachers condemned her. Papist leanings and foreign diplomats courted her alliance, hoping to use her influence in their broader games. John Knox, Scotland's most zealous Protestant reformer, publicly accused her of trying to re-establish papal rule. His fiery sermons didn't merely incite the masses, they encouraged sedition. In private, Mary wrote poetry often melancholic and introspective, and kept an extensive correspondence with powerful figures across Europe. These writings reveal a woman painfully aware of her position, hemmed in by tradition, isolated by politics, and constantly surveilled. She wasn't naive, but neither was she free. The constraints placed on her as a monarch and as a woman would define every subsequent decision and misstep. One detail that is often omitted from polished portrayals is the extent to which Mary's body, even in her prime, was subject to scrutiny and symbolism. Every pregnancy was a matter of state, every miscarriage a national disappointment. One unsettling rumor whispered in noble circles suggested that after her arrival in Scotland, some Protestant nobles demanded evidence she was fertile and intact, an unconfirmed but telling reflection of the deeply patriarchal and invasive expectations placed upon her. Her very body was a battlefield. The pressure to remarry mounted quickly. Her council, the foreign courts, and even her enemies understood that a strategic union could either stabilize or destroy her reign. Yet each potential suitor presented more risk than reward. When she eventually married her cousin Henry Stuart Lord Darnley in 1565, the decision proved fateful. Though the union was politically advantageous, solidifying her claim to both the Scottish and English thrones, it introduced a new toxin into Mary's already poisoned court. But that, as they say, is another unraveling. For now, the child queen had returned to a hostile homeland, placed upon a throne built less of stone than of sand. The calm before the storm was filled with ominous signs, coded messages, fractured alliances, and sermons that seemed to foretell doom. Mary, Queen of Scots, was not merely ruling. She was surviving. And survival in this world came at a terrible cost. Mary's early reign in Scotland was characterized by an almost constant effort to reconcile opposing forces, religious, political, and personal. Yet by 1565, these forces had become impossible to appease. Her marriage to Henry Stuart Lord Darnley initially seemed like a masterstroke. Darnley was young, handsome, and of royal blood, uniting two claims to the English throne. But appearances were deceiving. Beneath the elegant court attire and practiced courtly manners, Darnley was arrogant, volatile, and deeply insecure. Almost immediately, his ambition became apparent. He insisted on being granted the title King of Scots, with the power to rule jointly, something Mary refused. Tensions mounted quickly. The court fractured, with many of Mary's closest advisors and supporters, especially Protestant nobles, viewing Darnley as a dangerous liability. Even Mary, who had once referred to him fondly in letters, began distancing herself. By late 1565, she had become emotionally and politically estranged from her husband. Things grew worse with the rise of David Rizzio, Mary's Italian secretary. Rizzio was Catholic, foreign, and exceedingly close to the Queen, a combination that made him an object of suspicion and envy. Darnley, furious at being marginalized, became convinced that Mary and Rizzio were having an affair. Whether this was true or merely a pretext is unknown, but the psychological toll of the accusation and its consequences would shape Mary's trajectory irrevocably. On the evening of March 9, 1566, Mary, then 6 months pregnant, was dining in her private chambers at Holyrood Palace with Rizzio and several attendants. Darnley and a group of armed Protestant nobles stormed in. In a scene as grotesque as it was politically calculated, they dragged Rizzio from the Queen's side and stabbed him over 50 times in front of her. Blood soaked the floor. Mary was pinned in place, her swollen belly exposed, as her friend was butchered before her eyes. The assassination was not just personal, it was public theater. The message was clear: Mary could be humiliated and controlled. The stress of the ordeal nearly caused her to miscarry. For days after, she was kept under house arrest in her own palace, watched by the very men who had orchestrated the murder. But Mary proved more resilient than expected. She manipulated Darnley's vanity, convincing him the conspirators would turn on him next. Together, they fled to Dunbar Castle under cover of night. Mary returned to Edinburgh with an army and swiftly regained control of the capital. But the trauma had hardened her. A new calculation emerged. Survival now demanded ruthless political decisions. Darnley, already despised, became more isolated than ever. Within months, he was dead. In February 1567, Darnley's residence at Kirko Field was destroyed by a mysterious explosion. His body was found outside, dressed only in a nightshirt and bearing signs of strangulation, not shrapnel. The symbolism was disturbing: a murdered king in the open air. His dignity stripped away, his death only partially masked by the wreckage. It was the perfect scandal, too visible to ignore, too murky to resolve cleanly. Suspicion quickly fell on James Hepburn, the Earl of Bothwell, a powerful noble and Mary's apparent confidant. Less than 3 months after Darnley's death, Mary married Bothwell. Whether this was out of love, desperation, or coercion remains one of history's most contested questions. Some sources suggest she was abducted and raped by Bothwell, and pressured into the marriage to preserve her honor, a grim reflection of the era's brutal gender politics. Others argue that she conspired with him to eliminate Darnley and consolidate power. The Scottish nobility, already discontented, erupted. A powerful confederation of lords raised arms against the Queen. The image of Mary had shifted: no longer the elegant widow or tragic mother, she was now framed as a seductress, a murderess, a monarch corrupted. They captured her at Carberry Hill after a standoff, and Bothwell fled into exile. The victors wasted no time. Mary was imprisoned at Loch Castle and forced to abdicate the throne in favor of her 1-year-old son, James the Squirsangs. The abdication document was signed under duress. Her jailers reportedly threatened to kill her unless she complied. She miscarried twins during this captivity, a detail often forgotten but crucial in understanding the extent of her physical and emotional suffering. The walls of Loch Leven held more than a queen they contained, the unraveling of a human being alone, bereaved and disgraced. But Mary was not finished. In May 1568, she escaped the castle and raised an army. At the Battle of Langside, her forces were defeated, and she fled once more, this time across the English border, hoping for protection from her cousin Elizabeth III. It would be the last time Mary ever set foot in freedom. What she found in England was not refuge, but another prison. Elizabeth, cautious and calculating, saw no advantage in aiding a Catholic claimant to her throne. Mary was placed under house arrest. Her movements restricted, her letters intercepted. Scotland had rejected her. France had abandoned her. England caged her. And in that silence, her legend began to ferment, stripped of power yet increasingly dangerous. Mary's exile in England marked a shift from political agency to symbolic threat. While her body was confined, her image gained force, no longer a queen ruling lands, but a queen haunting them. Yet before she would become a martyr, she would first become a suspect in one of the most brutal political murders in British history. Lord Darnley's death had not faded from memory. Though Mary's forced abdication in 1567 had allowed her enemies to claim moral victory, the suspicious circumstances of Darnley's murder refused to recede. In England, Elizabeth's court demanded an inquiry before offering aid. The resulting investigation, staged at York and then Westminster in late 1568, was not a criminal trial but a political performance. Central to the case were the notorious casket letters, allegedly written by Mary to the Earl of Bothwell, implicating her in Darnley's death and revealing a deep romantic connection. These letters were produced by Scottish lords opposed to Mary. Written in French and containing scandalous passages, they were never conclusively proven to be authentic. Some historians suspect forgery, others suspect selective editing, and still others believe they were genuine. Elizabeth Ever the tactician refused to rule on their veracity. Instead, she used their existence to justify continued detention. But public scrutiny wasn't confined to royal courts. Across Protestant Europe, pamphlets circulated depicting Mary as a Jezebel, a sensual, conniving woman who had betrayed her husband and defiled her crown. In Catholic strongholds, however, she became a victim, a woman betrayed by malevolent advisors and Protestant zealots. This duality, whore or martyr, followed her every step in captivity. What is often forgotten is the extent to which the murder itself was disturbingly symbolic. Darnley, at the time of his death, had been recovering from illness in a house adjacent to a churchyard. That house, Kirkhope Field, was blown apart by gunpowder in the middle of the night. But his body was found outside, not inside, suggesting he had fled before the explosion or had been removed and strangled afterward. He was found with no obvious external wounds, and yet signs of asphyxiation were apparent. The murder was thus not only calculated, it was ritualistic in its theatricality. Equally grim was how the body was presented to the public. Contemporary sketches and eyewitness accounts describe Darnley's corpse lying half naked in the ruins, with a dagger nearby and a cloak spread beneath him, as if in mockery of royal dignity. For weeks, rumors swirled about necromancy, satanic rites, and the use of poisons or black arts, though no proof emerged. Still, the image stuck a king murdered not in war or rebellion, but in some grotesque domestic ceremony of betrayal. This macabre vision of Darnley's end magnified the public horror of Mary's role. Whether she was an active conspirator or a powerless pawn, the very fact that she married Bothwell so soon after the killing cast an indelible stain on her legacy. The English court, obsessed with appearances, took particular interest in how quickly she had resumed royal functions, including wearing mourning black for the minimal acceptable time. Her enemies insisted she had plotted the death to marry a man she loved. Others argued she was manipulated, perhaps even raped, and forced into marriage to preserve her shattered dignity. Meanwhile, Mary's physical health began to deteriorate under the weight of years in confinement. She suffered from migraines, rheumatism, and bouts of depression. Her rooms were regularly searched. Her letters were smuggled out in cipher. She was not imprisoned in a dungeon, but in a cage of soft furnishings, polite surveillance, and psychological warfare. One obscure but telling detail, Mary was forced to sell her own jewels to pay the wages of her household staff, emphasizing how entirely she had lost control of her finances, her household, and her autonomy. Perhaps most unnerving was how Elizabeth's government manipulated the very idea of legality. Mary, a crowned queen, was not formally charged with Darnley's murder, nor with any specific crime in England. Yet she was subjected to what modern observers would call indefinite detention. She became a legal anomaly, neither a prisoner of war nor a criminal. Her confinement was explained as a protective measure, but in reality she was a hostage to Elizabeth's political fears. The image of Mary shifted again in this period. Artists portrayed her in increasingly pious poses, dressed in somber black, often with a crucifix in hand. Catholic poets wrote elegies to her suffering. Even Protestant commentators admitted she carried herself with queenly grace. But this external dignity concealed a growing inner turmoil. The betrayal, the murder, the miscarriage at Loch Leven, and now the purgatory of endless imprisonment, each trauma compounded the next. There were whispers that Mary wept nightly, praying aloud in Latin for hours. Some servants reported she refused to eat on certain anniversaries, especially March 9th, the day Rizzio was murdered before her eyes. On that day, it was said she would sit for hours in silence, facing the window clutching a rosary made from jet black beads. No court physician would dare comment, but the signs of what modern medicine would recognize as post-traumatic stress were unmistakable. And yet despite it all, she remained a beacon for rebellion. Her very existence was a problem Elizabeth could not resolve. Catholic plotters across Europe whispered of rescue. Her name was invoked in the masses of exiled priests and in the secret sacraments of English recusants. In Scotland, her son James VI grew up under Protestant tutors, but even his mother's shadow reached across the border. Mary's association with Darnley's death had made her unfit to rule, but the brutal manner of that death, his half-naked corpse among the ruins, strangled and discarded like rubbish, made her unfit even to be forgotten. The consequences of that night in Kirkhofield would echo for years. And for Mary, the reckoning had only just begun. Mary's escape to England in 1568 marked the final collapse of her personal sovereignty. Though she had crossed the border seeking protection, she found herself instead cast into a uniquely English limbo, neither criminal nor guest, but something far more ominous. Elizabeth I refused to meet her cousin in person. Instead, she assigned trusted nobles like the Earl of Shrewsbury to serve as jailers under the guise of hosts. The architecture of Mary's imprisonment was as psychological as it was physical. Each great house she was transferred to Bolton Castle, Sheffield Manor, Tutbury, came with locked gates guards and an invisible leash held tightly by Elizabeth's government. The official reason for her detention remained vague. She was too dangerous to be free. As a Catholic with a legitimate claim to the English throne, Mary had become the gravitational center for every anti-Elizabeth conspiracy in Europe. The papal bull Regnans in Excelsis in 1570, which excommunicated Elizabeth and released her subjects from allegiance, only deepened the crisis. In the eyes of the Vatican and many Catholic monarchs, Elizabeth was now a heretic usurper and Mary a rightful queen unjustly caged. Over the next 2 decades, Mary would be moved from one residence to another. She was accompanied by a dwindling household staff, loyal but aging and cut off from nearly every friend and ally. Her days were tightly regimented. Meals were monitored. Visitors were filtered. Her letters, when not intercepted, had to be written in code or entrusted to couriers who risked torture or death if caught. The conditions were intentionally isolating. But perhaps the most cruel tactic used against her was one of slow erosion of status of agency and of hope. Mary's health deteriorated year by year. She suffered from joint pain, toothaches, insomnia, and a persistent ulcer on her leg. Her once flawless complexion became pale and sallow. Her movements became slower, more cautious. Physicians prescribed treatments typical of the time, bloodletting purgatives, vinegar compresses, and strange herbal mixtures. None were effective. One particularly disturbing account from 1578 described how leeches were applied behind her ears in an attempt to balance her humors. This grotesque image of former queen subjected to medieval medicine in a cold English manner captures the full indignity of her decline. Still, Mary was far from passive. She maintained an active correspondence with Catholic supporters across Europe. She wrote dozens of letters each month, some of them encrypted using ciphers that had to be smuggled out, sewn into clothing, or hidden in barrels of beer. These were not just emotional outpourings. They were strategic communications coded with political intent. She remained involved in plots, foreign intrigues, and the desperate hope of securing French or Spanish aid to restore her throne, or at least her freedom. One of the strangest and most psychologically revealing details from this time is Mary's obsession with embroidery. She filled entire tapestries with elaborate symbols, phoenixes rising from flames, crowned thistles, monograms wrapped in chains. These were more than idle craftwork. They were political declarations, veiled messages stitched in silk. One unfinished embroidery discovered after her death showed a crowned motto wrapped in a serpent devouring its own tail, a chilling metaphor for her own never-ending captivity. Elizabeth's government meanwhile tightened the noose. Walsingham, the Queen's spy master, built an elaborate network of informants and code breakers. He intercepted Mary's letters, interrogated her servants, and baited her into indiscretion. Each intercepted message was a potential noose, each cipher a trap waiting to be sprung. Mary's quarters were filled with servants who secretly worked for Elizabeth's council. Even her chaplains and cooks were suspected. The walls had ears, and those ears belonged to men who were paid in silence and betrayal. By the early 1580s, England was a nation on edge. The failed Throckmorton plot of 1583, a plan to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne, with Spanish support, rekindled national paranoia. Though Mary denied involvement, the mere whisper of her name was enough to justify continued confinement and heightened surveillance. Then came a hauntingly ironic twist. Mary's own son, James VI of Scotland, showed no interest in rescuing her. Focused on securing English succession through diplomacy rather than war, James distanced himself from his mother, treating her more as a liability than a parent. The rejection cut deep. For Mary, it was perhaps the final confirmation that her isolation was total, not just political, but familial, maternal, and human. She was now 50, arthritic, and haunted. Her letters became more urgent, her prayers more desperate. She still signed them as Queen of Scots, but it was a title increasingly hollow in power and recognition. In the margins of her devotional books, she scribbled lines from the Psalms, especially those invoking vengeance, justice, and deliverance. Yet perhaps the most disturbing element of Mary's life at this stage was not what was done to her, but what was withheld. No official charges, no trial, no end date. This was punishment without sentence, suffering without closure. She had become a living dead, a relic locked in a decaying house, kept alive, only so her enemies could say they were merciful. One guard recalled years later that Mary would often stand by the window during storms, watching the lightning flash across the English sky. She said it reminded her that God still moved above kings, he wrote. But her fate would not be left to God. It was being written by spy masters, courtiers, and queens. And the final chapter was about to be sealed by ink wax and betrayal. Fotheringhay Castle was bleak even by Tudor standards. Isolated in the flat countryside of Northamptonshire, it was surrounded by marshland and wind-blasted moors. Its great stone towers had once been the seat of Plantagenet princes. Now they served a far darker purpose. In September 1586, Mary, Queen of Scots, was transferred here under heavy guard. She would never leave. The move to Fotheringhay signaled a grim acceleration. For nearly 2 decades, Elizabeth had kept Mary under house arrest without formal charges. Now that would change. The reason was the Babington plot, a conspiracy that Walsingham's agents had meticulously cultivated, observed, and allowed to blossom until Mary herself became ensnared. The architect of the trap was Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman of romantic fervor and little discretion. Encouraged, perhaps manipulated by double agents, Babington and his circle devised a plan to assassinate Elizabeth Mary and restore Catholic rule. But the plot was compromised from the start. Every letter Babington wrote, every plan he described, was intercepted by Walsingham's network and decoded. The key moment came in July 1586 when Mary, from her isolation, replied to Babington in cipher endorsing the plan to murder Elizabeth. What Mary didn't know was that the letter had been opened, copied, resealed, and delivered by Walsingham's agents. The original sits today in the National Archives, its folds wax seal and marginal notes, silent witnesses to the moment Mary signed her own death warrant. The response within Elizabeth's council was immediate. Parliament demanded Mary's execution. Elizabeth hesitated, not because she doubted Mary's guilt, but because killing a fellow anointed monarch could set a dangerous precedent. Still, she allowed the machinery of justice to proceed. A commission of 36 nobles and judges convened at Fotheringhay in October 1586 to try Mary for treason. The trial was a legal farce. Mary, a sovereign queen, was charged under English law despite never having been an English subject. She was denied counsel. She wasn't allowed to review the evidence in full. She objected to the court's legitimacy, asserting that no court in England had jurisdiction over her. Her protestations were ignored. One disturbing detail during her trial, Mary was surrounded not by guards but by hostile judges seated above her, their red robes creating a wall of color that visually diminished her stature. It was theater designed not to determine guilt, but to display it. When the proceedings concluded, the commissioners wasted little time. On October 25th, they found Mary guilty and recommended execution. Still, Elizabeth wavered. She knew Mary's death would provoke outrage among Catholic monarchs. It might inspire rebellion in England or an invasion from Spain. And yet to spare Mary was to look weak. Elizabeth's solution was politically cunning and morally evasive. She signed the death warrant in secret on February 1st, 1587, and instructed that it not be carried out without further authorization. But her Privy Council, exhausted by years of delay, moved ahead anyway. Without informing the Queen, they dispatched the warrant to Fotheringhay. When Elizabeth later claimed ignorance, it was both plausible and convenient. The Crown had maintained deniability even in the act of state-sanctioned execution. Mary received word on the evening of February 7th. She had less than 24 hours to prepare for death. Her response was eerily calm. She asked for her chaplain a final mass and to write her will. She distributed her clothing and possessions among her attendants, and spent the night writing farewell letters to family members and political allies. In one note to the King of France, she wrote, "I die a Catholic, a Scottish queen, and a Frenchwoman." At dawn on February 8th, 1587, Mary was led from her chamber to the Great Hall of Fotheringhay. The execution was to be a public spectacle witnessed by 300 officials, nobles, and observers. She wore a gown of black velvet, a white veil, and beneath it all a crimson underdress the color of Catholic martyrdom. As she descended the stairs, she walked slowly unaided despite her arthritis. The hall was cold, the floor strewn with straw to absorb blood. At the front of the hall stood the execution block, 2 masked axemen, and the scaffold. Mary asked to be helped onto the platform, then knelt before the block. She prayed aloud in Latin and English, asking for forgiveness and declaring herself innocent of any crime. Her final words before placing her head on the block were, "Into thy hands, O Lord, I commend my spirit." But the death did not go smoothly. The first strike of the axe missed the neck and hit the back of her head, exposing bone and splattering blood across the straw. A low groan escaped her lips. The second blow struck true, severing much of the neck, but not all. The executioner had to saw the remaining flesh with the axe to complete the beheading. Then came one of the most grotesque moments recorded in English history. The executioner lifted the severed head to display it to the crowd and proclaimed, "God save Queen Elizabeth." But as he held it aloft, Mary's auburn wig came off in his hand. Her actual hair, gray, thinned, and cropped short, remained attached to the skull that fell to the floor with a thud. A gasp swept through the crowd. The illusion of youth carefully maintained had vanished in an instant. Then her dog, a small Skye Terrier, was discovered hiding under her skirt, soaked in blood and trembling. No one had noticed it had followed her onto the scaffold. The animal refused to be removed and had to be forcibly carried away. It would not eat or stop howling for days. The entire scene, botched, theatrical, unholy, was a grotesque inversion of royal ritual. There were no anointings, no hymns of triumph, only blood-broken protocol and the strange stillness of a crowd witnessing something too terrible to process. Mary, Queen of Scots, was dead, but the horror of her final moments would resonate far beyond the cold walls of Fotheringhay. The aftermath of Mary's execution was not the dignified silence of resolution, but a political firestorm of consequences, recriminations, and retaliations. Elizabeth's calculated hesitation was immediately undercut by the irreversible spectacle of state violence. When word reached her that the death sentence had been carried out without her final explicit approval, Elizabeth flew into a fury. Whether her outrage was sincere or staged remains debated. She imprisoned her secretary William Davison, who had dispatched the warrant, and insisted publicly at least that she had been deceived by overzealous subordinates. But outside the walls of courtly politics, the reaction was far less forgiving. In Catholic Europe, the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was received as a monstrous crime. Philip II of Spain, long fuming over English interference in the Netherlands and privateering raids on Spanish ships, now had the martyr he needed. Mary's death became the rallying cry for the Spanish Armada launched the following year in 1588, with the ambition of toppling Elizabeth and restoring Catholic rule in England. Domestically, Mary's death achieved its immediate goal, removing a dangerous rival. Yet even in death, she remained potent. Far from extinguishing her claim, the execution created a symbol that Elizabeth's enemies could not ignore. Mary became a martyr not merely because she died, but because of how she died. The crimson dress, the Latin prayers, the small dog at her side, these elements were immortalized in clandestine Catholic literature, in paintings and in whispered masses held in defiance of Protestant law. Perhaps most disturbingly, the psychological toll of Mary's death extended to those who had witnessed or administered it. Several of the attending officials were reportedly haunted by what they had seen. Some fell ill. One died within the year under mysterious circumstances. The axeman himself is said to have abandoned his profession. A Protestant observer who had initially supported the execution later wrote in a private letter that never was so foul a deed dressed in robes of legality. The law had been followed, but justice had not been seen. The disposal of Mary's body was similarly revealing. She was buried with muted ceremony at Peterborough Cathedral, not in a royal crypt, but in a place chosen for its political neutrality. For years her grave remained unvisited and unadorned. Elizabeth had forbidden mourning dress or official memorials. It was as if the regime feared that even Mary's corpse might incite rebellion. But memory cannot be buried so easily. Over the following decades, Catholic polemicists portrayed Mary as a saintly figure unjustly slain by a heretic regime. In 1612, her son James VI, by then King James I of England, ordered her remains exhumed and moved to Westminster Abbey, where she was placed in a magnificent tomb opposite Elizabeth's own. The gesture was a striking act of rebalancing the mother Elizabeth had condemned, now lay face to face with her executioner in the most sacred hall of English monarchy. One detail often overlooked in this reburial is the tomb's iconography. While Elizabeth's effigy is regal and composed, Mary's is uniquely expressive, her hands crossed in prayer, her features softer, more human. This was no accident. James was not merely honoring a parent, he was shaping a narrative. Mary would be remembered not as a traitor, but as a royal whose tragedy had been redeemed. The long-term consequences of Mary's death rippled through British politics and identity. Her execution formalized a precedent that a monarch could be tried and executed under civil law. That precedent, dangerous though it was, would later resurface in 1649 when Charles I, Elizabeth's own successor, was beheaded after a trial by Parliament. Mary's death thus inaugurated a modern age in which the sacred aura of monarchy could be shattered by the blade of legal judgment. Psychologically, the trauma of Mary's execution embedded itself in the English consciousness. The Tudors had governed by spectacle progresses, portraits, masks, but Mary's execution had been a spectacle too grim even for them to fully control. It revealed the unstable foundations beneath the crown paranoia manipulation and the raw brutality of power. From the Catholic perspective, Mary's martyrdom took on religious resonance. She was venerated unofficially as a saint, particularly in France and among English recusants. Relics appeared scraps of her gown pieces of the block. Even locks of her hair were preserved as holy items. In 1793, during the French Revolution, her tomb was opened by revolutionaries hoping to loot gold. Instead, they reportedly stood in silence over her corpse, shocked by the stillness of her resting expression. But while Mary's body may have found peace, her story did not. Even in popular culture, centuries later, she remains a figure of contradiction, either the tragic queen undone by ambition or the innocent victim of Protestant tyranny. Her image has been reshaped in novels, operas, films, and plays. Each version adds or subtracts something: more romance, less politics, more betrayal, less agency. And yet the core remains unchanged. A woman torn apart by the crown, she inherited the men who surrounded her and the machine that needed her dead to survive. Few executions in history have been so poorly carried out. Fewer still have echoed so loudly. What Mary endured in life was unbearable. What she endured in death was unforgettable. In the wake of Mary's execution, Europe stood divided religiously, politically, and emotionally. For England, the storm that followed was one of both diplomacy and dread. Elizabeth's advisors scrambled to contain the backlash, especially from France and Spain, both of whom had once courted Mary as a potential queen consort or political ally. The image of a Catholic queen stripped of her dignity and butchered like a criminal inflamed tensions and laid bare the cruel efficiency of Elizabethan statecraft. But the implications extended far beyond Mary's contemporaries. What her enemies had orchestrated was not merely the elimination of a rival, but the calculated construction of a narrative, that of a sovereign queen who had become too dangerous to exist. Yet the facts of her downfall refused to conform to a clean arc. Each stage of Mary's demise, her imprisonment, her trial, her death was mired in contradiction and cruelty. One of the most psychologically intense aspects of her final years, often glossed over, was the campaign to not just silence Mary's voice, but to erase her inner life. While imprisoned at Chartley Hall in 1586, just prior to her move to Fotheringhay, Mary's ciphered letters were not only intercepted, but duplicated and placed back in her quarters, creating the illusion that they had never been touched. This act of manipulation was more than surveillance. It was a violation of mental space. Every line she wrote, every thought she committed to paper was being mirrored and decoded. Her mind became a theater of espionage. Even more chilling was the use of her secretaries as pawns. Gilbert Gifford once thought a loyal courier had become a double agent. Others were bribed or blackmailed into disclosing cipher systems. The betrayal wasn't just physical, it was psychological warfare, waged quietly behind curtains and within letters, where loyalty became indistinguishable from manipulation. And still Mary kept writing. In her final coded messages, some written barely a month before her arrest, she speaks of divine justice, martyrdom, and the inevitability of her end. God knows my heart. She wrote in one intercepted note, and that I am innocent of the crimes they lay at my feet. These were not just the pleas of a prisoner. They were the political statements of a queen who understood that even in death her cause could outlive her. Meanwhile, Elizabeth's court became increasingly anxious. The Spanish Armada loomed, Catholic priests were hunted across England, and plots continued to swirl like smoke from a fire that refused to die. In this climate, Mary's execution took on a broader significance. It was a line drawn in blood between old and new orders, between monarchy sanctified by religion and monarchy secured by policy, espionage, and fear. One macabre detail from this period deserves special attention. After her execution, Mary's heart and viscera were removed from her body and buried secretly on the castle grounds. The official reason was to prevent the spread of disease. But many saw it as symbolic. Her heart, still loyal to Rome, had to be hidden away to prevent it from becoming a relic for Catholic rebellion. No one marked the spot. It was a burial without honor, perhaps the final gesture of control over a body long since stripped of autonomy. Yet the very effort to suppress Mary's memory only intensified it. Stories of her composure at the scaffold spread across Europe. In Catholic households, portraits of her in mourning dress, often stylized with a halo or crucifix, were displayed in secret. Some Jesuit seminaries required students to read aloud accounts of her death to strengthen their faith. The Church never canonized her, but in the imagination of persecuted Catholics, she had already become a saint. Mary's death also left its mark on English governance. Elizabeth, once seen as a cautious pragmatist, was now viewed as a ruler willing to cross sacred boundaries to secure power. The notion that a queen could sign the death warrant of another and try to disown the consequences introduced a disturbing precedent. From this point forward, monarchy in England was no longer above politics. It had become a participant in its darkest mechanisms. The reverberations touched Scotland, too. James II, ever the political tactician, did not rise in anger over his mother's death. He sent only a formal protest. His silence was a bargain. In exchange, he secured his path to the English throne. When he eventually succeeded Elizabeth in 1603, it was not as the son of Mary the Martyr, but as the architect of Anglo-Scottish union. His mother's execution was a sacrifice he had long since accepted as the price of stability. And yet history would not let Mary go. In the decades that followed, plays and ballads recounted her story with varying degrees of sympathy. Protestant England remembered her as a dangerous woman who had threatened the realm. Catholic Europe remembered her as a queen brought low by treachery. But the truth as always lay somewhere in between. Mary was both flawed and victimized, both political agent and manipulated pawn. Perhaps the most enduring testament to her legacy lies in the words she left behind, not the lofty proclamations of royalty, but the quiet, desperate verses she wrote in captivity. In one, she compared herself to a ship cast upon the rocks. The winds were false, the pilot blind. The sea was deep, the stars unkind. She had been misled. She had been betrayed. But she had not gone quietly. And for those who read her final letters, study her torn tapestries, or stand before her tomb in Westminster Abbey, it becomes clear that Mary, Queen of Scots, died long before the axe fell. The true execution began the day she crossed the border into England, when a queen became a prisoner, and a prisoner became a symbol too dangerous to live. Time did not erase Mary's memory. Instead, it transformed her first into a relic, then into a legend, and finally into a figure of perpetual debate. Generations after her execution, Mary, Queen of Scots would be invoked as everything from a Catholic martyr to a cautionary tale of female ambition. Her tragic death was not the end of her influence. In many ways, it was the beginning. Her image was reassembled by nearly every faction that sought to use her. In 17th century France, she was venerated in court masques as a model of piety and feminine grace. In 18th century Scotland, Romantic poets invoked her suffering as a national wound. In the 19th century, Victorians turned her into a Gothic heroine, tragic regal and impossibly elegant. The Mary of history faded beneath layers of narrative and costume, but even within these mythologies, fragments of disturbing reality endured. The records of her trial, her letters in cipher, the reports of her execution each testified to a different kind of horror, one harder to romanticize the slow obliteration of personhood beneath the machinery of power. Perhaps nowhere is this more evident than in the treatment of her body after death. Though she was reburied at Westminster Abbey, it was not until 1612, 25 years after her execution, that her son James I arranged for the transfer. The original burial at Peterborough Cathedral had been intentionally austere, designed to erase any possibility of a cult. But in the years between her death and reinterment, Mary's resting place had become a quiet site of illicit pilgrimage. Flowers were left. Prayers were whispered. Elizabeth's government had tried to eliminate the woman, but inadvertently created a martyr. James's choice to move her to Westminster was not purely filial piety. It was political theater carefully designed to close a chapter that could still threaten the monarchy. By placing Mary opposite Elizabeth in death, James performed an act of symbolic reconciliation. But the tombs say more than their marble suggests. Elizabeth's effigy shows her holding a scepter and orb, symbols of undisputed authority. Mary's is different, hands folded in prayer, eyes cast down, a queen still pleading even in stone. In the centuries that followed, historians and artists picked through the wreckage of her story. The casket letters were dissected endlessly. Were they real, forged, partially fabricated? Each interpretation said as much about the era asking the question as it did about Mary herself. Protestant writers emphasized her ambition and supposed immorality. Catholic authors portrayed her as a passive sufferer, sacrificed by malevolent English heretics. But modern scholarship has moved beyond these binaries. Mary was neither wholly innocent nor entirely guilty. She was a complex ruler navigating a treacherous landscape of patriarchy, factionalism, and espionage. Her greatest misstep was perhaps trusting too long in titles and bloodlines, that the identity of queen would be enough to protect her. In reality, it was that very identity that doomed her. The psychological cruelty she endured has only recently been fully appreciated. Unlike her cousin Elizabeth, who cultivated control through deliberate solitude, Mary was deeply relational. Her identity was tied to her ability to command loyalty, affection, and presence. Isolation dismantled that selfhood piece by piece. By the time of her execution, she had spent over 18 years in confinement, longer than she had ever reigned. One rarely discussed aspect of Mary's legacy is how it altered the perception of queenship itself. After her death, the English monarchy approached female succession with greater caution. No woman would rule alone again until Queen Anne over a century later, and even then under the shadow of legal constraints designed to prevent another Mary. In her fall, Mary reshaped the rules of monarchy not by what she did, but by what was done to her. Yet despite all efforts to contain or reinterpret her, the central horror of Mary's death remains unavoidable. A sovereign queen executed by another sovereign queen in a spectacle of blood and contradiction. It was a moment when law cloaked vengeance, when pageantry could not conceal pain, and when history was carved into the scaffold at Fotheringhay. And still centuries later we look back, because the story refuses to die. Not because of the politics, not even because of the religion, but because of the human cost. A young woman torn from her homeland, a monarch outmaneuvered and entrapped. a mother separated from her child, a prisoner who prayed until the axe fell, a legend born not in life but in death. Mary, Queen of Scots, never truly found justice. But in her story we find a mirror of the past, one that reflects the sharp edge of power, the depth of human suffering, and the echo of a scream no executioner could silence. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots was not a footnote, it was a rupture. It fractured notions of divine right, of female sovereignty, and of justice itself. In the years and centuries that followed, her story echoed across Europe not only as political precedent, but as emotional parable. Her life became a warning, and her death a symbol. Mary's fate was determined not just by her decisions, but by the hostile terrain she navigated, a world in which a Catholic queen could not rule a Protestant land, where marriage was both weapon and trap, and where diplomacy often masked betrayal. She was brilliant, flawed, resilient, and ultimately outmaneuvered, but her legacy endured. Artists, poets, historians, and revolutionaries all found in her a figure they could reshape. She was the saint of the oppressed, the seductress of the reckless, the queen undone by love, the pawn of empire. Yet beyond the myths, there remains the fact of a woman born to rule, stripped of freedom, and executed with a cruelty that haunted even her enemies. Elizabeth would reign for another 16 years after Mary's death, but the shadow of that act never fully lifted. When James I succeeded to the throne, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland, it was Mary's bloodline, not Elizabeth's, that endured. And so in death, Mary won the one thing denied to her in life, a future. The dynasty she birthed would reign over Great Britain for centuries. But it came at the price of her dignity, her body, and her voice. What remains is the silence after the axe fell. Not justice, not triumph, just silence. And within that silence, the echo of a queen who would not be forgotten.